I'd like to talk to you about the elephant in the room. Not a particular elephant, but the whole idea that elephants get in rooms. Now, I think you've all been in this situation. You're in a meeting, people are taking notes, they're asking questions, but the main reason, the main purpose, the whole reason you're sitting in the room is not addressed. Now, this is a rather remarkable phenomenon if you stop to think about it. Rational, well-educated people consciously avoiding the issues. Why do we do this? And the answer is simple, and I think you all know it. But like the elephant in the room, I think it's good to name it. Politeness, face-saving, fear of embarrassment, fear of your boss, in sum, social control. Anthropologists study social control. It's a fundamental principle of human societies. It's one of those things that doesn't change. And the first thing to say about it, therefore, is it's not all bad. Honor, shame, reputation, gossip, these are the things that civilization is made of. But social control has some downsides, as we've seen. And this is particularly true when it's linked up with what anthropologists call cultural control. Now, the concept of cultural control was invented by an anthropologist at Berkeley named Laura Nader. And she wanted to understand how powerful groups and organizations shape our everyday actions and thoughts. There's some infamous examples of cultural control. Nazism is a clear one. We all recognize it as an ideology. But everyday racism also is cultural control that actually brings us to believe that some people are less human than others. But cultural control doesn't usually take these elephant-like proportions. And that's the cultural control I want to study. The first thing to say about cultural control is, like social control, it's not all bad. It's a fundamental principle also of human societies. We couldn't live without it. We can't question our ideas every day. We can't go about wondering. Nonetheless, we are influenced by cultural control in our everyday lives. When we censor ourselves because we think, ooh, that's not cool. Or when we say, ooh, I'm feeling down, I'm going to go out and buy something. Or when we look at a magazine and suddenly we feel like we look bad just because that model looks really good. This is everyday cultural control. So cultural control and social control can combine to prevent us from asking important questions, to prevent us from asking which are the important questions, and perhaps worse, to prevent us from asking uncomfortable or disturbing questions. In sum, these are forces that limit our ability to shape change. So, I'd like to present you with my new app. My app is a way to help you shape change, to limit the effects of social and cultural control. My app is called Say What.
Say what?
Elizabeth Brown, ladies and gentlemen, Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Give her a hand. My app is a mental app. You don't need to buy it. You don't need to download it onto a machine. You can carry it around in your head. It's light, it's fun, it's even good exercise. Think of it as a kind of mental Pilates, or a Sudoku with a point to make. Say What involves asking 4 questions: who, how, alternatives, and trade-offs. And these are questions you can ask in your everyday life. Anytime your gut says to you, what's going on here? What's at stake here? So I'm going to take an example from my everyday life as a professor, and let me assure you, it is not sexy. This is not because my life is particularly boring. Actually, I have the best job in the world. Don't tell anyone. This is because I think shaping change is necessary in our everyday lives. Most of our lives are everyday lives. We don't have heroic possibilities all the time that fall into our laps. Most of what we do is everyday, mundane, routine activity. So that's where shaping change comes in. So what's my example? Next week, I'm going to a meeting. So far, so good. A bunch of us professors are meeting, and our task is to harmonize our course curricula and course descriptions so that they are more readable, more comparable across disciplines, across faculties, and even across universities. So you're going to say, that's a pretty harmless task. Why are you bothering with that? But I want to make my life more interesting, and I want to make this meeting more interesting, so I'm going to use my app. The first question is who? Whose idea is this? Where did this idea come from? And if you trace through the paper trail, it's actually quite interesting. Of course, it goes up to our dean's office and to the rector's office, then to the Swiss Council of Rectors, up to the Swiss Confederacy, and then, as all roads in Europe, it leads to Brussels. Now, this is a long paper trail. It stretches out over thousands of pages and probably a couple of decades. So that's a lot of paper. That is to say, that's a lot of trees. And where there's a lot of trees, there's probably some stakes. But what are the stakes? That's when you need to ask the how question. How is the problem framed? So how is this problem we've set out to resolve framed? Well, if you look through the documentation, it seems to be a problem of student mobility. Students aren't mobile enough. And mobility is good, we are told. Actually, we're not told that mobility is good. Somehow it just goes without saying. Mobility is good. In my 13 years as a professor, I've actually never heard this discussed. Why is mobility good? Is it good? What kind of mobility? How much mobility? What are we trying to attain here? But if you look at the documentation, actually the stakes are quite clearly spelled out. They're related to two rather large goals that the European Union has set itself. The first is to encourage a kind of common European citizenship, especially among highly trained professionals. And by encouraging student mobility, the idea is that students will come to see themselves as European, in addition to their national citizenships. And the second is related to the economic situation. It's to create a labor market, a common labor market for skilled labor in Europe. So that's a pretty big economic program. And who would have thought that these two rather large programs are related to what we will be doing at our table at the banks of the lovely Lake of Neuchâtel next week. My point is, the solution we've been handed, rewriting our course descriptions, has completely framed our sense of the problem. And it's blinded us to alternatives. So that's my next question, alternatives. What are the alternatives? Not only the alternative solutions, which might be rather technical, but the alternative problems. This gets us into the heart of what I'm calling the everyday democratic process. Because considering alternatives means considering the problem as it's stated. Is this the right problem? It means digging in to the trade-offs. It means digging in to the whole issues that are being put onto the table. So in my case, what are the alternatives? Well, if you look at the US higher educational system, it's actually quite interesting, because in the United States, there's enormous student mobility from universities to universities with absolutely no standardization. No one has asked Harvard and Stanford to unify or harmonize their course descriptions or their curricula. Quite to the contrary, probably those universities are going to set out to distinguish themselves as much as they can from one another, to encourage student mobility. And students are very mobile, partly because of this. Now, is this a good thing? I can see some advantages. I can see some disadvantages. Students in the United States leave their families very young. They live on campuses where they're quite cut off from their surrounding communities. And this constant mobility gets in the way of building up long loyalties to place. And that's a characteristic of American society generally. But my point is not to decide whether mobility is good or bad. My point is to say that we need to consider the trade-offs. We need to think them through. And that brings me to my fourth question. Who's gaining, who's winning? Losing. Trade-offs are about winners and losers. And winners and losers are at the heart of the democratic process. We like to forget this because it would be so much nicer if democracy were about consensus, if it were like a win-win situation. But democracy is about deliberation and choice-making in contexts where trade-offs are absolutely necessary. So we need to fold this in to our deliberative processes. We need to acknowledge the fact of trade-offs if we're going to do a thorough thinking through of what the issues are and what the solutions are. And in my case, the trade-offs are quite numerous. Should we encourage mobility? Why? Should we not do this activity that's being asked of us, not harmonize our course material? Why? Should we refuse to obey our rectorate and annoy them? If I were the rectorate, I'd say no. Should we just obey? They would say yes. I don't know the answers to these questions, but I'm pretty sure these are the right questions to be asking in this everyday situation. Who, how, alternatives, and trade-offs. These are the things that help us think through a complex situation and get to our choices. These are the questions we should be asking to the complex problems we face in the 21st century and to the elephants in the room. Now, when I was preparing this conference, I looked up the phrase elephants in the room. And according to Wikipedia, probably this phrase is related to a short story that Mark Twain wrote in 1882 called The Stolen White Elephant. And apparently this phrase circulated around in the next decades. And the first documented use of the phrase, an elephant in the living room, can be dated to 1959 in a New York Times article. And then the phrase continued to circulate with increasing speed up until the 21st century, where it's now a standard phrase in our everyday vocabulary. So my question was, is the increased pace of change that we have lived over the last decades related to the increased use of this phrase? Could we say that as we enter the 21st century, there are more and more elephants in more and more rooms? Now, that would make sense if we look at the enormity of the problems we have to solve in the coming decades. Climate change, resource depletion, increasing social injustice and inequality. And it makes even more sense if we look at the apparent inability we have to face up to these problems squarely, to admit them, and to deal with them. Indeed, we could symbolize the entire range of crises we're facing in the 21st century by the fact that the world's remaining elephants are all actually living in rooms, in parks and reserves for the lucky ones, and in zoos for the less lucky. So, for the sake of those elephants, but for many other reasons, we need to start asking a lot more questions. And asking questions takes courage, it takes tact, it takes determination, it takes inventiveness. It is not easy to shape change in this way. But perhaps the change that's easy is not the change we want to see happen. So we need to fold much more social courage into our everyday activities. We need to ask questions. We need to consider alternatives. We need to weigh the trade-offs. We need to give ourselves the time for this kind of deliberation. This, I believe, is the way we're going to shape change. This is everyday democracy in action. And each of us can do it in our modest ways, in our everyday lives. Thank you.